There's a small village in the Amazon where it rains, on average 330 days a year. The people who live there don't carry umbrellas. They don't check the weather app. They don't even think about rain as a problem. Because for them, rain isn't weather, it's the default. And watching how they live inside that default will reframe everything you think you know about what humans actually need. We like to think that humans have always hated rain. We invented roofs. We invented drains. We invented the entire modern suburb, partly to escape the inconvenience of getting wet. And it makes sense, because to us, rain is an interruption. It's a thing that gets in the way of a day we're trying to have. But for 99.9% of human history, that framing was impossible. Rain wasn't an interruption, it was the background. And the question of what humans did when it rained wasn't a question of inconvenience. It was a question of survival, of culture, of who we became as a species. Because rain didn't just happen sometimes, it happened a lot. And the people who learned to live inside it built something that most modern humans have forgotten how to access. Let's start with how much of it there actually was. In 2014, a group of climate modelers at the University of Texas published a paper that nobody really noticed outside their field. They had spent years running simulations of what prehistoric rainfall would have looked like across Africa, Asia, and Europe during the periods when humans were first spreading across the planet. The result was not subtle. In large parts of East Africa where Homo sapiens evolved, average rainfall was 30 to 50% higher than it is today. And more importantly, the rain wasn't evenly distributed. It came in long, sustained bursts, weeks at a time, sometimes months. This wasn't a place where you had a rainy season. It was a place where you lived inside the rain and waited for the sun to briefly visit. And that's important, because every story we tell ourselves about the ancestral human environment comes from a dry savanna, the hunter on the open plain, the fire under the stars, the long walk to water. But for most of the past 300,000 years, that picture is wrong. For most of it, our ancestors were not living on the open plain. They were living in the wet. The first thing that becomes obvious when you start looking at this is that shelter wasn't optional. In a dry climate, you can sleep under a tree, you can find a rock overhang, you can get through a night. In a wet climate, none of that works. Wet wood rots, wet ground breeds disease, wet cold kills faster than dry cold, because water pulls heat out of your body 25 times faster than air. For our ancestors, shelter was the first invention, not the wheel, not fire, shelter. The earliest clear evidence of constructed shelter comes from a 400,000-year-old site in Nice, France. Researchers found a series of carefully arranged stones forming the base of what was almost certainly a roofed structure, and the shape of it was telling. It wasn't a windbreak, it wasn't a sunshade, it was a sloped roof, designed specifically to move water away from the people sleeping under it. The first buildings weren't about keeping people in, they were about keeping the rain out. And this is where something interesting starts to happen. Because once you have shelter, once rain stops being a daily threat to your survival, something else emerges. Time. In a dry climate, the structure of a day is simple. You work when the sun is up, you rest when it isn't. In a wet climate, the structure of a day breaks. You can't hunt in a downpour. You can't forage in a flooded forest. You can't make tools when everything is soaked. So when a rainstorm comes, and the climate models suggest they came often, entire communities were forced to stop. Not permanently, not forever, but for hours at a time, sometimes for days. And what they did in those hours is the part of the story nobody talks about. Because the first thing that happens when a group of people are stuck inside together, with no productive work to do, is that they start talking. Anthropologists studying modern rainforest groups who still live in conditions similar to what our ancestors faced, have documented this in detail. When a heavy rain falls and the camp can't move, the activity pattern inside the shelter shifts. There is less work. There is less movement. There is instead conversation, stories, songs, the slow recounting of family histories, the teaching of skills to younger members, the kind of low-intensity, high-connection social activity that doesn't fit cleanly into any modern category. In 2019, a research team in the Congo Basin published a study tracking 12 months of activity in a Bantu village. They found that during periods of extended rainfall, the time spent on what they called non-task social interaction increased by 340%. That's not a typo, 340%. And here's the part that's easy to miss. This wasn't a leisure activity. It wasn't the village taking a break. It was the village doing something essential. They were maintaining the social fabric that would let them survive the next dry season. They were transferring knowledge. They were building the trust that would let them cooperate under pressure. Rain, in other words, was the original social reset button. But there's another layer to this, and it might be the most important one. In 2003, a researcher named Andrea Bender ran a series of experiments in a small community in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, where rainfall averages more than 300 days a year. She wasn't studying the weather, she was studying the people. What she found was that these communities operated with a fundamentally different sense of time. They didn't think in days. They didn't think in hours. They thought in weather patterns. Their entire cognitive framework was organized around the question of when it was dry enough to act. This wasn't primitive. It wasn't a lack of sophistication. It was a different way of being. And there was something else. The community members she studied reported a kind of psychological state that Western participants in the same studies couldn't reproduce. A specific kind of calm, a specific kind of patience, a specific kind of presence. They had a word for it. They didn't have a translation, but the closest Western researchers could get was something like settled waiting. And this is the part of the story that actually matters, because most modern humans have never experienced this state. We live in a world where the only acceptable response to rain is to make it stop, to go inside, to wait it out, to fill the time with something, a podcast, a task, a screen, anything to avoid the experience of being still inside a moment we can't control. We have built an entire infrastructure, physical, psychological, economic, to make sure we never have to be present during a rainstorm. And in doing so, we have lost access to a state of mind that our ancestors accessed almost by default, not because they were wiser, not because they were more spiritual, but because the structure of their world forced them into it. A rainstorm, for them, was permission to stop, permission to be in a place, with people, in a moment, with nothing to do about it. In 2017, a group of psychologists in Berlin ran an unusual experiment. They took 60 volunteers and asked them to sit in a small, windowless room for 2 hours. No phones, no books, no tasks, just themselves. Half the room had soft, ambient sounds of rainfall playing. Half the room had silence. The silence group reported rapidly increasing anxiety, agitation, and discomfort. Most of them asked to leave within 30 minutes. The rain group lasted the full 2 hours. Many of them reported a state they described as unexpectedly peaceful. The researchers' conclusion was cautious. They didn't claim that rain is therapeutic. They didn't claim it's a cure for anything. But they noted that the sound of rain, specifically, the unpredictability of it, the soft random patterning, appeared to engage a kind of attentional state that silence and active stimulation both failed to. The closest comparison in the existing literature was meditation. But the volunteers weren't meditating. They were just listening. So what does this actually mean for you? It means that every time you hear rain, and your first instinct is to escape it, to fill it, to mute it, to wait it out, you are turning away from a state of being that your species spent 300,000 years building. Not a religion, not a tradition, a way of being inside time. We are the only species on this planet that has engineered itself out of weather. We are the only species that has built a world where rain is an interruption, not a fact. And the cost of that engineering is something we can't quite name. A restlessness, a background anxiety, a sense that even our leisure has to be productive. Our ancestors didn't have that. They had something else, something we don't have a word for. The people in that Amazon village aren't more enlightened than you. They aren't more in touch with nature. They aren't spiritually superior. They just never built the machinery to escape the rain in the first place. And because of that, they still have access to something most of us have lost. The next time it rains, and you're tempted to fill the silence, try something small. Just listen.